Flight attendant kicks two black siblings off a plane, not knowing their father owns the airline. Amina adjusted the strap of her bag as she stepped onto the plane, her younger brother Zayn right behind her. The first-class cabin was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Spacious, quiet, and luxurious in a way that felt almost unreal. Zayn's eyes widened, his fingers gripping the straps of his backpack as he took in the plush, reclining seats. The crisp, white tablecloths folded neatly on the armrests and the soft golden lighting that cast a warm glow over the cabin. "Whoa," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Amina smiled at his excitement. Their father, always busy with business, had booked them these seats as a special treat for their trip. First class wasn't something they were used to, but after years of watching other passengers turn left toward these premium seats while they shuffled to economy, this felt like a small, rare luxury. They found their seats, 3A and 3B, placing their bags in the overhead bin with care. Amina settled into her chair, adjusting her seatbelt while Zayn pressed his nose against the window, marveling at the sight of airport staff moving luggage onto the plane. He had been thrilled since their father first told them about the flight, asking a million questions about what first class would be like, what kind of food they'd get, and if he'd be able to watch movies on a bigger screen. Seeing his excitement now made Amina smile until a presence looming over them made her look up. A tall flight attendant stood beside them, her polished name tag reading Miss Calloway. She had a professional demeanor, her uniform pristine, her hair pulled back into a perfect bun. But there was something else in her expression, an unreadable flicker in her eyes, a tension that hadn't been there when she greeted other passengers moments ago. "Excuse me," she said, her voice smooth but firm, her gaze flickering between them. "Are you sure these are your seats?" Amina blinked, momentarily confused. "Yes," she said, reaching for her boarding pass. "Here's our—" Ms. Calloway barely glanced at the tickets before cutting her off. "This is first class." Amina's fingers tightened around the armrest. "We know," she said, keeping her voice even. Zayn shifted beside her, confusion replacing his excitement. "Our dad booked these seats for us," he added, his voice small but sure. "Sawama." Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. The way she looked at them sent a strange chill down Amina's spine. Not questioning, but doubting, as if something about them didn't add up. She stood still for a moment, eyes narrowing slightly before giving a clipped nod. "I see." Without another word, she turned and walked away. Zayn leaned closer to Amina, lowering his voice. "Why did she ask that?" Amina exhaled. "I don't know." Minutes passed, the other passengers settling into their seats, chatting, ordering drinks. But Amina couldn't shake the uneasy feeling bubbling inside her. Then, just as she began to relax, Ms. Calloway returned. But she wasn't alone. An older flight attendant, Mr. Hensley, stood beside her. His silver-streaked hair gave him an air of experience, and his expression was carefully neutral. But something in his posture, in the way he squared his shoulders before speaking, sent alarm bells ringing in Amina's mind. "We need you both to step out of first class for a moment," Mr. Hensley said, his tone polite but unyielding. Amina's stomach tightened. "Why?" "There's been a discrepancy with your tickets," he replied, still avoiding eye contact. "It's just a quick verification." "But we already showed our tickets," Amina pointed out, her voice steady but laced with growing unease. "There's no discrepancy." Zayn clutched the armrest, his excitement now fully replaced with apprehension. "Why do we have to move?" he asked quietly. Ms. Calloway folded her arms. "We can do this the easy way," she said, her voice sharpening, "or we can call security." The weight of the moment pressed down on Amina's chest. The way she said it, like a warning, like a threat, made her fingers curl into fists at her sides. She felt the stares now. The way passengers had started to turn their heads, whispering, watching, but saying nothing. Not a single person spoke up for them. Not one. Amina inhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. There was no point in arguing here, not when they were being treated as if they had done something wrong. She reached for her bag, nudging Zayn to follow. He hesitated, his small hands gripping the armrest before he finally stood, his head lowered, his excitement crushed. The whispers followed them down the aisle. No one asked what was happening. No one questioned why two quiet, well-mannered kids were being forced off the plane. The moment they stepped onto the jet bridge, the door shut behind them with a firm, unyielding click. A uniformed security officer stood nearby, his expression unreadable but watchful, as if expecting them to protest, to cause a scene. Amina reached for her phone, her hands trembling as she scrolled to her father's number. Her breath hitched as she pressed call. The moment he answered, her voice wavered. "Dad, they just kicked us off the plane." Silence, then a slow, measured response. "Who did?" Amina swallowed, her jaw tightening as she turned her head slightly, watching through the small window as Ms. Calloway and Mr. Hensley reboarded the plane, leaving them behind. "The flight crew," she said quietly. Another pause. But this time it wasn't confusion or disbelief. It was something else, something colder. "Stay where you are," her father said, his voice unreadable. "Don't speak to anyone. I'll handle this." Amina's fingers curled around her phone. She didn't know what he was going to do, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not even close. Amina's fingers trembled as she lowered her phone from her ear, her father's words echoing in her mind. "Stay where you are. Don't speak to anyone. I'll handle this." And there was no anger in his voice, no yelling, no outburst of frustration. But that was what made it even more terrifying. She knew her father. She had seen him navigate impossible business deals with ruthless efficiency, had watched him dismantle obstacles with nothing more than a phone call and a sharp gaze. He wasn't the kind of man who acted without precision. And right now, someone had just made the worst mistake of their career. Beside her, Zane shifted uncomfortably, his small hands gripping the straps of his backpack as he sank into one of the terminal chairs. The brightness that had once filled his eyes, the bubbling excitement that had made him chatter endlessly about his first-class experience, was gone. Now his expression was guarded, confused, the weight of what had just happened settling into his young shoulders. "Amina," his voice was soft, hesitant. "Are we getting back on the plane?" She exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "I don't know." They sat in silence as passengers bustled through the terminal, indifferent to the two siblings stranded outside the flight they were supposed to be on. The security officer stationed near the gate kept his eyes on them, arms crossed, watching them as if they were some kind of problem that needed to be contained. Amina clenched her jaw, resisting the urge to glare back. They had done nothing wrong. And yet, here they were, thrown out of their seats, humiliated, reduced to nothing but whispers and sideways glances from people who had been too afraid or too indifferent to speak up. A sharp voice crackled over the intercom. "Miss Calloway, please report to the front desk immediately." Amina's head snapped up, her heart thudding. She turned to Zane, who had straightened in his chair, eyes wide. "What do you think that's about?" he asked. Amina didn't answer, but deep down she knew. Something was happening, and Miss Calloway had no idea what was coming. Across the terminal, the flight attendant in question emerged from the jet bridge, her posture still stiff with authority, until she saw the gate agent, Mr. Denton, waiting for her with a carefully blank expression. Amina watched as Calloway's confident stride faltered for the briefest moment before she approached the desk, her shoulders tightening as Mr. Denton leaned in, speaking low but firm. Then something incredible happened. Miss Calloway's face drained of color. Even from a distance, Amina could see the shift, the way the tension in her jaw flickered into something else. Not defiance, not indignation, fear. Mr. Denton turned slightly, gesturing toward a nearby airport official holding a phone to his ear. The man glanced at Miss Calloway before saying something into the receiver. Amina didn't need to hear the conversation. She already knew exactly who was on the other end of that call. Miss Calloway frowned, then opened her mouth as if to argue, but Mr. Denton's expression hardened, cutting her off. She swallowed, her shoulders rising as she took a slow, measured breath. And then, without another word, she turned. Her eyes met Amina's. For the first time, the look in them wasn't dismissive. It wasn't indifferent. It was realization. And that was when Amina knew. Miss Calloway finally understood just how badly she had miscalculated. The minutes stretched on, heavy with anticipation. Zane fidgeted beside her, gripping the hem of his hoodie. "Do you think she's gonna—" Before he could finish, the gate agent's voice rang out again, this time louder, clearer. "Miss Holloway, Mr. Holloway, you are cleared to reboard the aircraft." The power shift was complete. Amina stood slowly, shoulders squaring as she met Miss Calloway's reluctant gaze. The flight attendant didn't say anything, but the rigid line of her mouth spoke volumes. She had no choice now, no control over the situation she had so confidently created. She had judged them, assumed they didn't belong, and now she had been forced to bring them back. Miss Calloway gestured stiffly toward the jet bridge. This way. Zane hesitated. Do we have to? Emina turned to him, the quiet uncertainty in his voice tightening something deep in her chest. He didn't sound excited anymore. Didn't sound eager to reclaim what had been unfairly taken from him. He just sounded tired. We'll go back, she said. Then shifting her gaze back to Miss Calloway, she added, but I want to hear you say it. Miss Calloway's nostrils flared slightly. Say what? Amina tilted her head, her voice calm, even. You assumed we didn't belong here. The silence around them was suffocating. Passengers waiting to board their own flights pretended not to listen, but their stillness betrayed them. Miss Calloway glanced over her shoulder. Mr. Denton was still watching. So was the airport official. She clenched her jaw. I misjudged the situation, she said finally, her voice clipped. That's not what I asked. Miss Calloway inhaled sharply, her fingers curling against her palm. She looked at the ground. I made an assumption, she said, her voice quieter now. And I was wrong. Amina let the words hang in the air for a moment, absorbing them. Then without another word, she turned and walked toward the jet bridge, Zane following closely behind. The flight felt different this time. Every passenger who had watched them leave now watched them return. The tension in the air was thick, almost tangible, but yeah. Then a voice, a low mutter from across the aisle. About time. Miss Calloway stiffened. Another voice, softer. They never should have been asked to leave. For the first time since this began, the scrutiny wasn't on Amina and Zane. It was on her. She turned sharply and disappeared toward the front of the cabin, her back rigid, her steps quick. She's not in control anymore, Amina murmured. Zane let out a slow breath. And she hates it. Amina smirked slightly. Yeah. Then as the plane prepared for takeoff, she checked her phone. A new message from her father had come in. Dad, sit tight. This isn't over yet. Amina smiled. Miss Calloway thought the worst was behind her. She had no idea. Amina sat stiffly in her first-class seat, gripping the armrest, her body tense despite the plush luxury surrounding her. She had expected to feel relieved when they were finally led back onto the plane, expected to feel vindicated, but all she felt was exhaustion. Zane, who had once bounced in his seat with excitement, now sat quietly beside her, his fingers idly playing with the hem of his hoodie. The thrill of first class, the reclining seats, the extra legroom, the elegant ambiance had been stripped away. Instead, all that remained was the weight of the stairs. Passengers stole glances at them, some quickly averting their eyes when Amina caught them looking, others more shameless in their curiosity. The same people who had watched them be thrown off the plane without a word were now watching them return, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others pretending as if nothing had happened. Amina could see the change in the air, the way some passengers who had clearly been content to let the injustice unfold now wore stiff expressions as if realizing too late that their silence had made them complicit. And then there was Miss Calloway, the flight attendant who had, with all the confidence in the world, humiliated them in front of an entire cabin, now stood before them, her usual poised authority replaced by something far less certain. She was rigid, her carefully practiced smile nowhere to be seen, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Amina could see it in her eyes, the discomfort, the unwillingness, the knowledge that she was being forced to do something she never thought she would have to. She cleared her throat, glancing down at Amina and Zane, her jaw tight. I need to apologize, she said, her voice thin, controlled, and utterly insincere. Amina didn't move. She didn't blink. She just watched. Zane, still small in his seat, barely met Miss Calloway's gaze. Amina could feel the stiffness in his shoulders, the way he held himself just a little smaller than before. He shouldn't have to be here, shouldn't have to hear this. A scripted, rehearsed apology, one forced out of fear rather than remorse. Miss Calloway inhaled sharply, clearly uncomfortable, but she pushed forward, her words stiff, forced. I made an assumption, and I was wrong. she said, her lips pressing together. Amina tilted her head. She let the silence stretch, let the moment linger too long. She could see the way Miss Kamaktewe shifted on her feet, the way her fingers twitched as if resisting the urge to clench into fists. Amina exhaled, her voice steady, deliberate. "Are you apologizing because you mean it?" she asked, tilting her head. "Or because you got caught?" A flicker of something crossed Miss Calloway's face. Anger, perhaps, or something dangerously close to shame. "I," she started but stopped. She couldn't say it, because they both knew the answer. The air in the cabin felt thick, weighed down by the stifling silence. Even the hum of the plane's engine felt muted in comparison to the unspoken words hanging between them. Amina let out a slow breath. "That's what I thought." Zane finally spoke, his voice small, hesitant. "Would you have done the same thing if we looked different?" Miss Calloway froze. Her lips parted slightly, but nothing came out. She didn't answer. And that was the answer. Amina felt something ache inside her chest. Not for Miss Calloway, but for Zane, for the way his voice had lost its excitement, for the way he had learned a truth today and that he should have never had to learn so young. Miss Calloway swallowed, her eyes darting away for the first time. Amina had seen a lot of things in people's faces before. Irritation, disbelief, condescension. But now she saw something new in Miss Calloway. Doubt. She had spent years believing she was always right, that her authority was unquestionable. But now she was standing before two children she had humiliated, and she was realizing for the first time that she might not be the person she had always thought herself to be. Still, it wasn't enough. Miss Calloway forced her posture straight, gripping onto the remnants of control she had left. "If there's anything you need during the flight," she said, her voice clipped, her carefully curated professionalism slipping at the edges, "please let me know." Amina leaned back into her seat, watching as Miss Calloway turned sharply and walked away, her spine too straight, too stiff, as if trying desperately to pretend she was still in charge. The moment she disappeared toward the front of the cabin, Zane let out a long breath, slumping against his seat. That was, he hesitated, rubbing his palms against his jeans. Weird. Amina didn't respond immediately. She reached for her phone, the screen lighting up with a new message. "Dad, everything taken care of. Sit tight. This isn't over yet." Amina swallowed, her fingers tightening around the device. Miss Calloway thought this was the worst of it. She was wrong. Across the cabin, murmurs had started, not loud, not disruptive, but still there. Some passengers had witnessed everything. A few, like the woman from earlier, looked guilty, while others simply looked uncomfortable. A flight attendant, not Miss Calloway, approached quietly. She was younger, her name tag reading Hannah. She hesitated before speaking. "I just wanted to say," she started carefully, glancing between them, "I'm really sorry for what happened earlier." Amina's eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you saying that because you mean it, or because you saw how things played out?" Hannah didn't flinch. "Because I mean it." Amina studied her for a moment before nodding once. "Then why didn't you say anything before?" Hannah exhaled, looking down briefly. "Because I've seen things like this happen before, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere." She glanced back up, her expression sincere. "But I was wrong." The words hit differently, not rehearsed, not forced, just honest. Amina finally gave a small nod. "Okay." Hannah offered a small, understanding smile before stepping away. Zane turned toward his sister, his voice barely above a whisper. "You believe her?" Amina sighed. "I don't know." Zane slumped in his seat. "At least she said something." Amina glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Miss Calloway stood, silent, isolated. "She only said it when it was safe to," Amina murmured. Zane didn't respond, but she knew he understood. The plane hummed steadily, cruising through the sky. The worst was over. But for Miss Calloway, the real consequences were only just beginning. Amina sat still, staring straight ahead, but she could feel the weight of the whispers around her. The murmurs, the stolen glances, the passengers who had ignored her and Zane when they were thrown off the plane. Now they were whispering, but not about them. Not anymore. Now their attention had shifted. Now the whispers were about Miss Calloway. For the first time, she was the one being watched, the one being judged. The rigid posture, the carefully pressed uniform, the once confident stride, all of it had shattered under the realization of what she had done. She stood near the front of the cabin, avoiding eye contact, her fingers gripping the cart of refreshments as though it were the only thing keeping her standing. Zayn, beside Amina, had yet to touch the movie he had once been so excited about. Instead, his fingers drummed softly against the armrest, the movement small, nervous. His shoulders were hunched, and when he spoke, his voice was smaller than it had ever been before. "Do you think she really means it?" Amina didn't answer right away. She turned her head slightly, watching Miss Calloway out of the corner of her eye. She could see the way the other flight attendants moved around her, but didn't acknowledge her. The way her presence no longer commanded authority the way it had before. They had all seen it. They had watched her make the decision to remove two kids from their rightful seats, and now they were waiting for her to face the consequences. "I don't think she cares about what she did," Amina said finally. "I think she just cares that she got caught." Zayn sighed, sinking into his seat. "Yeah," he murmured. "That's what I thought." The hum of the plane filled the silence between them, but then a voice, soft, hesitant, cut through the tension. "I just wanted to say—" Amina turned her head. It was the older woman from across the aisle, the same one who had spoken up after they had been brought back onto the plane. Her reading glasses were perched on the bridge of her nose, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but her expression was one of quiet regret. "I should have said something," the woman admitted, her voice low but steady. "I saw what happened. I saw how she looked at you before she even checked your tickets." Amina's fingers curled against the armrest. "Then why didn't you?" The woman hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I don't know," she confessed. "Maybe because I didn't want to make a scene. Maybe because I didn't think it was my place. Or," she exhaled shakily, "maybe because I was scared." Amina studied her carefully, searching for dishonesty, but there was none. There was only truth, raw and unguarded. "You were scared of what?" she asked quietly. The woman's eyes lifted, and for the first time, Amina saw guilt in them. "I don't know," she whispered. "Scared of what it would mean if I acknowledged what was really happening." The words landed heavier than Amina expected. She had braced herself for another empty apology, another attempt to make her feel like everything was fine now that the situation had been fixed. But this was real. She let the silence stretch between them, then nodded. "At least you're saying it now." The woman's shoulders eased, her relief visible, and she turned back to her book. But not everyone had something to say. Most of the passengers around them remained silent, though Amina could see their discomfort in the way they shifted in their seats, in the way they suddenly found their screens and magazines so fascinating. It was easy to ignore injustice when it wasn't happening to you. But now they couldn't look away, and neither could Hannah. The younger flight attendant, the one who had hesitated but never participated, stood near the galley, watching everything unfold. After a moment, she took a deep breath and approached Amina and Zayn, her expression unreadable. "I wanted to check in on you two," she said softly. "Are you doing okay?" Amina tilted her head slightly. "Why do you care now?" Hannah didn't flinch. "Because I should have cared sooner," she admitted. "Because I saw what happened, and I didn't speak up." She exhaled, running a hand down the front of her uniform. "And that doesn't sit right with me." Zayn looked up at her. "Would you have said something if Miss Calloway wasn't in trouble?" Hannah hesitated for only a moment before answering. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I want to be better than that." Something in Amina's chest tightened. For the first time, someone was trying. Not just because they had to, not just because they were afraid of consequences, but because they wanted to do better. Amina exhaled, nodding once. "Okay." Hannah offered them a small, sincere smile before stepping away, but Amina knew her words weren't empty. She had felt the shift in her. She turned back to Zayn, who was watching her carefully. "Do you believe her?" he asked. Amina sighed. "I don't know." Zayn thought for a moment before shrugging. "At least she's saying it now." Amina smirked slightly. "Yeah." But as her gaze drifted toward the front of the plane where Miss Calloway stood alone, pretending to be busy, she knew one thing for sure. Hannah had learned something today. The woman in the seat across the aisle had learned something today. But Miss Calloway? She had learned nothing. And that was what made it worse. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even trying to be. She was just trying to survive the fallout. The next time she looked at her phone, child raised looked at her phone, a new message from her father had appeared. Dad, landing in 2 hours. Security is in place. Sit tight. Amina exhaled. Miss Calloway thought this was over. She had no idea. Amina exhaled slowly, gripping the armrest as the weight of the cabin settled around her. The hum of the plane's engines filled the air, steady and unbothered, as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. And now the tension inside first class was thick, unspoken but undeniable. Miss Calloway had returned to her duties, but she wasn't the same woman who had strutted down the aisle earlier, confident in her authority. No, now her movements were rigid, almost mechanical, her carefully crafted composure fraying at the edges. Amina could see it in the way she adjusted trays, in the way her fingers trembled ever so slightly as she poured drinks, in the way she avoided making eye contact with anyone. She had lost control, and she knew it. Passengers weren't ignoring her anymore. They were watching her, judging her, just as she had judged Amina and Zayn. The once invisible power she had wielded so effortlessly had been ripped from her hands, and now she stood in the ruins of it, forced to serve the very people who had witnessed her fall from grace. Amina almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then she looked at Zayn. He hadn't touched his screen, hadn't flipped through the in-flight menu, hadn't bounced in his seat the way he had when they first boarded. His hands, small and uncertain, fidgeted with the hem of his hoodie, his shoulders still curled inward as if trying to make himself smaller. That was why Amina didn't feel sorry, because Miss Calloway still had her uniform, her job for now. She would go home at the end of the day, changed but intact. But Zayn, his excitement had been stolen, his innocence bruised, and that wasn't something she could get back for him, not with an apology, not with justice, not even with Miss Calloway's impending punishment. Some wounds didn't heal that easily. Miss Calloway passed through the aisle again, offering drinks to the passengers. She didn't acknowledge Amina or Zayn. She didn't even pause at their row. But that wasn't an oversight, it was avoidance. She was afraid, not of them. Not of what they could do, but of what she had already done. The minutes stretched, heavy and suffocating, the flight dragging in a way that made Amina's skin crawl. The other flight attendants did their best to pretend nothing had happened, their smiles too bright, their movements too deliberate, as if they were trying to make up for Miss Calloway's mistakes without addressing them directly. And the passengers, oh, the passengers. Some had returned to their books, their movies, their overpriced cocktails, eager to move past the ugliness they had witnessed. Others still stole glances at Amina and Zayn, their eyes filled with something that might have been sympathy, or maybe guilt. Amina didn't care either way. She just wanted to land. Zayn sighed beside her, his voice barely above a whisper. This doesn't feel the same. Amina turned to him. What do you mean? He shifted, rubbing at his wrist. First class. Yeah, his lips pressed together. It doesn't feel special anymore. And that made Amina's heart ache in a way she hadn't expected, because he was right. It didn't matter that they had been given their seats back, that Miss Calloway had been forced to apologize, that the airline was now scrambling to make things right. The magic was gone. The excitement had been replaced with something heavier, something bitter and unavoidable. Zayn had learned something today, something she wished he never had to learn, that even when you followed the rules, even when you belonged, some people would still look at you and decide you didn't. Amina reached over, squeezing his hand gently. It's not first class that changed, she murmured. It's us. Zayn swallowed, nodding slightly, but the sadness in his eyes remained. The intercom crackled to life. Miss Calloway, please report to the cockpit immediately. The cabin shifted. Passengers exchanged glances. A few lifted their heads, curiosity sparking once more. Miss Calloway froze. Amina watched as the flight attendant's fingers clenched against the serving cart, her knuckles turning white. For a brief second, she looked like she might refuse, like she might melt into the floor rather than face whatever was waiting for her. But then, slowly, reluctantly, she turned and made her way toward the front of the plane, her footsteps heavier than before. She knows what's coming, Zayn murmured. Oh, and then Amina nodded. She should. Miss Calloway disappeared behind the curtain. The whispers in first class rose, and then silence. It stretched, thick and uneasy, as the passengers waited to see what would happen, waited to see if the woman who had once held so much power would finally lose it all. Amina's phone buzzed in her lap. Dad, it Barisabem. Landing in an hour, sit tight. She exhaled slowly, slipping the phone back into her pocket. The worst had already happened. But for Miss Calloway, her real punishment was only just beginning. What do you think? Do you think Miss Calloway deserved everything that happened? Should she have been given another chance? Or did she cross a line that couldn't be undone? How would you have reacted if you were Amina or Zane? Comment below with your thoughts. Your voice matters, and together we can bring attention to stories that need to be told. If you stand with Amina and Zane, hit the like button and share this story to start a conversation. Because silence is complicity, and some lessons should never have to be learned the hard way. Miss Calloway sat rigidly in the jump seat near the galley, her fingers curled tightly in her lap, her polished exterior beginning to crack. She had always prided herself on her ability to maintain control, to command a cabin with authority and grace, but now she was powerless. She could feel the weight of the passengers' whispers, the stares, the way her fellow flight attendants moved around her without acknowledgement. She was no longer the one in charge, and she hated it. The intercom crackled, pulling her attention away from her spiraling thoughts. Miss Calloway, please report to the cockpit immediately. Her stomach dropped. For a brief moment, she sat frozen, wishing she could ignore the call. But she knew that was not an option. Not when the man waiting on the other end of that call was Darius Holloway. She stood on shaky legs, smoothing down her uniform out of habit, but she knew there was no straightening this, no correcting it. Every step toward the cockpit felt heavier than the last. The sound of her heels against the carpet muted beneath the weight of her impending judgment. The flight deck door opened with a slow, controlled click, and she stepped inside. The air inside the cockpit felt thick, stifling. Captain Rowe sat in his chair, his hands folded, his jaw tight. He didn't look at her at first. Instead, he reached forward, pressing a button on the communication panel. A small speaker crackled to life, and then she heard him. Darius Holloway. His voice came through the line, calm, controlled, but carrying a weight that made her blood run cold. Miss Calloway, he said, her name rolling off his tongue like a warning. She swallowed hard, clasping her hands in front of her. Yes, sir. There was a pause, a long, deliberate pause. The kind that wasn't uncertain, but calculated. Then his voice returned, even softer this time. I assume you now understand exactly how badly you miscalculated today. The breath caught in her throat. There was no room for excuses, no space for the false confidence she once held. Darius Holloway wasn't a man she could explain away her actions to. She had humiliated his children, and now she would have to answer for it. Sir, don't bother. His voice was sharp, cutting straight through her attempt at damage control. I'm not interested in excuses. Her hands tightened into fists at her sides. Captain Rowe finally turned to her, his expression one of quiet disappointment. He wasn't angry, wasn't cruel, but that somehow made it worse. Darius spoke again, his voice steady, unwavering. Did you verify my children's tickets before asking them to move? Miss Calloway's throat tightened. She knew the answer, so did he, but she had to say it. No, sir. Another pause. So you assumed they didn't belong there? She felt her skin prickle with humiliation, her own reflection staring back at her from the darkened control panel. She hesitated, then exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes. There it was, spoken into the silence, clear, undeniable, irreversible. Darius Holloway let the words hang between them for a moment before continuing, his tone never once rising. He didn't need to yell. His control was more terrifying than rage. And did you question any other first-class passengers the same way? She squeezed her eyes shut for the briefest second, fighting the wave of nausea that rolled through her stomach. No. The final blow landed, and it was a crushing one. Captain Rowe inhaled deeply, shaking his head. Darius's voice dropped lower, quieter, deadly. You didn't hesitate when you ordered my children off that plane. You didn't second-guess yourself. You were certain. The weight of his words pressed down on her like a physical force. You were certain, Miss Calloway. Her hands trembled slightly. Darius let the silence stretch before delivering the final strike. Now so am I. Miss Calloway's pulse thundered in her ears. Captain Rowe leaned forward, resting his forearms on the controls. Mr. Holloway has requested an immediate review of your conduct upon landing. She forced herself to breathe through the panic. I understand. No, Captain Rowe said, his voice tight. I don't think you do. Darius spoke again, finality lacing every syllable. You will personally ensure my children receive the highest level of service for the remainder of this flight, he instructed. Not because they need comfort. They already know they belong in first class. But because I want the rest of the passengers to see what it looks like when someone is forced to acknowledge their mistake. She swallowed the lump in her throat. Yes, sir. And when this flight lands, Darius continued, you will explain yourself to the executive board. Miss Calloway's breath hitched. If her explanation was deemed unsatisfactory, she would no longer be employed by the airline. Captain Rowe pressed a button on the panel. The call ended. The speaker clicked off, but the weight of the conversation remained, pressing down on her like a 1,000-pound stone. She was done for. The captain turned to her once more, his voice void of emotion. You should get back to the cabin, he said. I suggest you make good use of the time you have left. Miss Calloway nodded stiffly, then turned and stepped out of the cockpit, her knees weak beneath her. The moment she re-entered the first-class cabin, all eyes were on her. She had removed Amina and Zane from their seats without a second thought. And now she was the one being watched. For the first time in her career, Miss Calloway had no control over what came next. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, but for Miss Calloway, the landing was anything but smooth. Every second of the descent had felt like a slow-motion fall toward the inevitable, the hum of the engines drowned out by the thunder of her own heartbeat. She had spent the remainder of the flight moving mechanically, attending to passengers with a stiff politeness that fooled no one. Every glance in her direction had been a judgment, a whispered condemnation, a reminder that she was no longer the one in control. But none of it compared to what was waiting for her outside this plane. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Miss Calloway tried to steady her breathing. She had told herself that maybe, just maybe, she could explain herself, that she could salvage her reputation, that she could convince corporate this had been a misunderstanding. But when she looked up, her last shred of hope shattered. Standing just beyond the jet bridge, visible through the small, reinforced window of the exit door, was Darius Holloway himself. He wasn't alone. Flanking him were two corporate executives, their suits crisp, their faces unreadable. A uniformed security officer stood beside them, his posture rigid, professional. But it was the way the airport staff kept their distance, the way flight attendants from other flights paused mid-stride, whispering among themselves. That confirmed it. This wasn't going to be a private conversation. Miss Calloway felt her pulse hammer against her throat. Passengers in first class noticed first. Their gazes flicked toward the front of the plane, recognizing the power shift before a word was even spoken. A few exchanged knowing looks, some pretending to be busy just to prolong their stay, eager to witness the unraveling of the woman who had commanded this cabin only hours before. Amina and Zane sat silently watching. For the first time, Miss Calloway couldn't look at them without flinching. The cabin crew began the final announcements, their voices a formality lost in the tension that gripped the front of the plane. The fastened seatbelt sign flicked off. People reached for their belongings. The sounds of luggage wheels clicking into place, compartments shutting, murmured conversations. All of it blurred into the background as Miss Calloway stood frozen, waiting for the moment she had dreaded. Then the doors opened. The first-class passengers had barely begun to disembark when the security officer stepped inside. His gaze locked onto her instantly, a silent summon. Miss Calloway, he said, his tone polite but unyielding. You need to come with us. The air inside the cabin shifted. The whispers became hushed gasps, passengers glancing at one another, some stealing looks at Amina and Zane. Miss Calloway's breath hitched. The same way Amina and Zane had been removed from this plane, Miss Calloway was now being escorted off of it. She opened her mouth, a protest forming, one last desperate attempt to regain the power that had already been stripped from her. But no words came out. She could already see them waiting. Darius Holloway stood just outside the jet bridge, his expression stone cold, unreadable. But his silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. Miss Calloway's steps were heavy as she walked down the narrow passage, the security officer following closely behind. The airport was too bright when she stepped into the terminal, too open, too exposing. And everyone was watching. Flight crews, airport staff, even passengers waiting for their own flights, all had paused. Darius Holloway didn't move. He simply watched her approach, his hands clasped neatly in front of him, a man who had already decided her fate before she even arrived. Miss Calloway swallowed hard. She stopped a few feet away from him, her shoulders squared in an attempt to salvage the last bit of dignity she had left. The silence was suffocating. Then finally Darius spoke. "You removed my children from their seats without verifying their tickets." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Miss Calloway inhaled sharply, but she knew there was no point in arguing. She had already admitted it. She started, but Darius's voice cut through her like ice. "No, enough!" Her lips snapped shut. Darius's gaze never wavered. He didn't speak loudly, didn't raise his voice, didn't demand attention. He didn't need to. His presence alone had commanded the entire room. "You didn't hesitate when you humiliated my children," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "You were certain when you forced them off the plane. Certain when you made an assumption without proof." Miss Calloway's throat tightened. Darius let the silence stretch before delivering the final, crushing blow. "Now I'm certain," he said simply. "You're fired." Miss Calloway swayed on her feet, as if the words had physically struck her. It was over. No meeting with corporate. No review process. Just termination. Final. Absolute. The airport was silent. Passengers stared, some in shock, others in grim satisfaction. The same people who had watched her take Amina and Zaina's seats away now watched her lose everything. A security officer stepped forward. "Please come with us, ma'am." Miss Calloway's eyes burned, her hands shaking at her sides. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to say something. But what could she say? She had built her entire career on her ability to command authority, to never be questioned. And now? Now she was the one being escorted out like a problem to be handled. Darius Holloway didn't watch her go. She was no longer worth his time. Amina and Zain stepped forward, walking toward their father. He looked at them, his expression finally softening. "Are you both okay?" Amina nodded. "We're fine." Zain hesitated before adding, "Now we are." Darius placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder before turning back toward the terminal. Behind them, Miss Calloway disappeared through the security doors. For the first time, she understood what it felt like to be powerless. As Amina and Zain walked through the airport terminal beside their father, the weight of everything that had happened settled over them. The automatic doors slid open, and the cool night air hit Amina's face, refreshing but not cleansing. She exhaled slowly, staring up at the endless sky, feeling the heaviness in her chest begin to shift, but not disappear. The world had not changed in the last few hours. The stars still shone, the city still pulsed with life, and airplanes still took off and landed in a steady rhythm. But she had changed. Zain walked quietly beside her, gripping the straps of his backpack, his usual energy dampened by everything he had seen and felt today. His sneakers scuffed against the smooth floors, his fingers twitching slightly, a telltale sign that he was still processing what had happened. His innocence had been bruised today, if not entirely lost, and that, more than anything, made Amina's stomach ache. Their father walked in silence, his presence commanding, unshaken, yet thoughtful. Darius Holloway was a man who never acted out of impulse, who never let emotions cloud his judgment. When he moved, he did so with precision. Today had been no different. He had seen injustice, he had handled it, and now he was letting the weight of it settle. Zain was the first to speak. His voice was small. "Do you think she's okay?" Amina turned toward him, eyebrows knitting together. "Who?" Zain hesitated. "Miss Calloway." Amina felt a flicker of surprise. He had every right to be angry, resentful, but Zain had always been different, softer, kinder, willing to see the humanity in people even when they didn't deserve it. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "She lost everything today." Zain's fingers curled around the strap of his backpack. Do you think she's sorry?" Amina was quiet for a long time before answering. I think she's sorry she got caught. Zayn bit his lip. That's not the same thing, is it? No, he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. Then why do I still feel bad? Amina exhaled slowly, turning her gaze toward him, toward his big, questioning eyes. The same eyes that had once looked at the world as if it were filled with nothing but wonder. But today those eyes had learned something different, something much colder. Because you have a good heart, she said gently, and she didn't. Zayn nodded, but his brows remained furrowed, his mind still tangled in the complexity of justice and consequence. Amina understood his conflict. It was easy to say that Miss Calloway got what she deserved. It was harder to see someone's life fall apart and not feel something, even if that person had been cruel to you. Their father finally spoke, his voice deep and certain. She made her choice, Darius said simply, and choices have consequences. Zayn looked up at him. But do you think she learned? Darius was quiet for a long time, then his gaze softened just slightly. That's not our lesson to worry about, he said. Ours is different. Amina tilted her head slightly. What's our lesson? Darius stopped walking, turning to look at both of them. The airport lights illuminated his face, making the lines of wisdom and experience even sharper. Our lesson is this, he said. People will judge you before they know you. They will make assumptions about who you are, what you deserve, and where you belong. You can't stop them from doing that, but you can choose how you respond. You can choose whether you let it define you or whether you prove them wrong. Amina's chest tightened. That was it, wasn't it? The truth of today, the truth of life. Zayn chewed his lip. But what if they never change? Darius placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Then it's their loss, not yours. Zayn let the words sink in, nodding slightly. Amina looked at him, at the way his shoulders seemed just a little stronger than before. Maybe this experience had stolen a piece of his innocence. But maybe, just maybe, it had given him something else in return. A deeper understanding of the world. A sharper view of who he was and who he could become. The automatic doors opened again, and the night air felt different this time. Lighter. Zayn let out a breath, stuffing his hands into his hoodie pockets. Do you think people will talk about what happened today? Amina smirked slightly. Oh, they'll talk about it. Zayn smiled a little. Good. And just like that, he straightened his shoulders, walking ahead of them toward the car, ready to move forward, ready to let go. Amina watched him for a moment before following, her father's voice still ringing in her ears. People will judge you before they know you. You can't stop them. But you can choose how you respond. She wasn't the same person who had stepped onto that plane hours ago. None of them were, and that was the greatest justice of all. What can we learn from this? This wasn't just a story about two kids getting kicked out of first class. This was a story about power, judgment, and accountability. It was about how easy it is for people to make assumptions, how hard it is for them to admit they were wrong, and how much courage it takes to stand up for yourself when no one else will. Have you ever been unfairly judged? Have you ever had someone assume you didn't belong somewhere, even though you did? How did you handle it? Comment below and share your story. Let's talk about it. Let's make sure no one else feels alone in their experience. Because here's the truth. The world isn't always fair. Some people will always see what they want to see, no matter how much you prove them wrong. But that doesn't mean you stop fighting. That doesn't mean you let them define you. Power isn't in what they think of you. It's in what you know about yourself. Your worth isn't determined by their judgment. And the most powerful thing you can do? Keep moving forward. Drop a comment below if this story spoke to you. Hit the like button if you stand with Amina and Zayn. Subscribe to the channel to hear more powerful stories that matter. Because some lessons need to be heard. Some stories deserve to be told. And your voice matters. Voice.